as Greg pointed out, I did chair the London Finance Commission. I'll say a word or two about that in a moment. It's a mayoral commission set up by Boris Johnson, independent members, and reported last year. But it inevitably bumped up against the question of whether London needs more access to its own public finance, and more than that, what it would do with that money and how it might make decisions if it did. I'll come on to all of this. Now, it's just worth remembering that the London unimagined growth that lies all around us comes after one of managed decline. And many of you will remember this or read this, that there were post-war policies actually to decentralise the UK economy after the Second World War. There were proposals, and there were indeed extensive programmes of slum clearance. The London County Council and the GLC worked with the government on new town policies to move people out of the overcrowded, particularly inner parts of London and to beyond. And this led to an extraordinary decline in London's population, down from 8.5 million in 1939 to 6.7 million as recently as 1985. And indeed it was thought in the mid-70s and into the early 80s that the population would continue to decline well below 6 million, which is of course about half of where it's now predicted it will be by the middle of the current century. So we had the unpredicted expansion after 1985, in which the population has risen all the way back from 6.7 to 8.5 million. And with projections, official projections, showing it rising to 9 million by 2020, it's almost certain it will hit that. It's rising at the rate of 100,000 a year at the moment, 10 million, and then 11 or 11.5 million by the middle of the century. And of course, these two things happening together, the managed decline followed by the unexpected and unpredicted expansion, has undoubtedly led to an attempted catch-up of investment. There's signalling still in use on the Underground that was put in on the assumption of a declining city with fewer people living in it. Use the District line, you'll see there are long headways. That's why they're long headways. Subsequently, we need, of course, 30, 35, 40 train an hour type services. So all of that is having to go on. Rail, tube, schools and hospitals. There's a hospital in Barking and Dagenham with a primary school, I should say, in Barking and Dagenham with 1,000 pupils in it. We need more schools, not just hardware, railways and so on. We need housing, schools and much more besides. Simply to keep pace with this extraordinary growth. Just think how many, I was working this out the other day, if the population grows to 10 million by 2030, or the back of my, back of the head, back of an envelope calculation, that would require workspace equivalent to about 6 or 7 times Canary Wharf. That's the kind of scale we're talking about. And of course there's also pressure on water, gas, electricity and telecoms infrastructure as a result of this growth. Britain is a notorious, along with other Anglo-Saxon countries, and Will and Andrew have both commented on this in the past, a notorious under-investor. This is simply looking at public sector net investment taken from the government's own documents as a share of all public expenditure in the period since the 1970s. As social housing investment has declined, you can see that there's been an average of around 4%. It's a booms and slumps sort of picture, usually counter Keynesian slump, booms in the boom time, slumps in the slump time. But you can see it averaging out there at about 4%. That's the UK as a whole, and that's probably a bit higher than that in London. But it's not a particularly high percentage given the overall scale of public expenditure. Now, it's often asked, and I can easily imagine why people outside London ask this question, given the extraordinary growth in London, given its success, given all those foreigners buying houses here, why doesn't London use its own growth to finance infrastructure? It's a rich city. Why shouldn't it pay for its own infrastructure? Why should the Treasury pay? London has a GDP of £350 billion a year, bigger than Wales, Scotland and Ireland added together, and significantly more. It pays 110 billion a year in taxation. Very large sum of money, much higher per head than any other region. The economy has grown faster than any other region for years, despite all the efforts of the last Labour government to help the other regions to catch up. London, the East and the South East continued to pull ahead. So why doesn't it use all of this to pay for its own infrastructure rather than expecting national government and the North and Scotland to pay for it? Well, the answer is because the United Kingdom is a uniquely centralised country where national government controls virtually all taxation and public expenditure. So if we look at this table, taken from OECD statistics, easily available on the internet, this table is taken from the London Finance Commission report, and it simply it asks the question, what are the taxes set by different levels of government as a share of gross domestic product? So you can see there in Canada, federal country, Germany a federal country, Sweden, rather shockingly not a federal country, very big local income tax. These figures in the range of sort of 10 to 15%. In highly centralised France, remember what we think about France, it's a very low figure, it's only 4.6%. But here in the UK, it's 1.7. That's the entire tax freedom available at the local level to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and all of local government throughout the United Kingdom. In fact, that figure's also capped. Because council tax is capped in Scotland and in England, that's effectively naught. So the UK is a weird outlier by international standards, and it feeds through to the number of taxes available to London, or indeed any other big city in the UK, which is one single awkward tax, the council tax. So the London Finance Commission, as I said, was appointed by the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson. It commissioned research in the best traditions of these sorts of activities. We looked at past reviews. It's worth looking at past reviews just to remind yourself that nothing can ever result from them. We looked at academic evidence about devolution, which suggests that it's not a massively powerful body of evidence that suggests that devolution leads to higher growth. But we read that the other way, which is to say there's no evidence either that it would undermine growth. We looked at Scotland and Wales, the extraordinary reforms that have taken place under the last government, devolving power, if not public finance yet, to Scotland and Wales, and the fact that that devolution did not lead the sky to fall in. We looked at the international evidence, some of which I've just shown you, also a very good paper, easily available on the LFC website, from the University of Toronto, looking at the tax systems in different cities, again, London and other UK cities, an extraordinary outlier compared with New York or Paris or Frankfurt or anywhere else. We looked at the city deal type policies being pursued within England, following on from what the previous government did, and we looked at London within the UK. We took written and oral evidence, we deliberated on the basis of principles we'd set for ourselves, all of this is pretty standard practice, reported in May last year, and subsequently have followed this up. We haven't just published the report and left it. We've been to talk to ministers, shadow ministers, civil servants, manifesto writers, business, anybody who might help in the drip, drip, drip process of trying to get some of these things changed. Now, what are the things that we were trying to get changed? Well, we made, knowing the background, looking at the fate of the Layfield and Lyons inquiries, we went for modest proposals. So we didn't, for example, suggest a local income tax. We didn't go that far. Largely on the grounds it just is never going to happen in Britain. You have to aim very low in Britain to get the most modest change, constitutionally or otherwise. But it would be very radical what we're proposing by UK standards, given the chart I showed a moment ago. So the LFC proposed that the full suite of property taxes and their operation should be devolved to London. Council tax, the whole of business rate, stamp duty, land tax, capital gains tax. There would also be a drawdown list of minor revenues, for example, the possibility of a tourist bed tax or some green taxes, and also the local determination of charges and fees. Many of you in this audience will be aware that in a localist government, many of the fees and charges that councils can set are determined centrally by national government. We think this is very unlocalist, we thought this was very unlocalist, and there needs to be greater freedom over these charges and fees as well. Not just the tax base would be devolved and the yield would be devolved, but also the operation and tax setting. This is much more radical, particularly in a country with the Treasury's setting every year of a total called total managed expenditure, where, in a sense, the whole of public expenditure by all agencies have to add up to that sum. So this is quite radical stuff within this modest set of proposals. Of course, on day one, London got access to and of course it already has access to the council tax and a bit of the business rate base, but the day the transfer took place, there would be an offsetting grant reduction, so that London would be neither better nor worse off on day one. Of course, that offset would only affect the property taxes transferred. For the new smaller taxes, which would be available not only London but frankly to any other part of the country, those would be additional. So those wouldn't be offset, otherwise there'd be no purpose in introducing them. What this would mean is an increase in the proportion of the taxes paid in London from 4%, so of all the taxes paid in London today, 4% are retained by local government, GLA and the boroughs, that's council tax. And these reforms would take that to 12%. And of course, in handling all of this, and I won't go into this today, that would require the GLA and the boroughs to come up with operational details for how they'd handle it, but the Mayor and the Chair of London Councils have said they can do that. What this would do? Well, London's tax base would increase from around 4 to 5 billion a year to 12 or 13 billion a year of the 110 billion. Forgive, these figures aren't exactly precise, it's quite hard to get them, interestingly. This would give a powerful incentive for the city to grow its own economy. If it grew this bigger tax base, do the maths, that if it's growing a tax base of, say, 12 or 13 billion with 3% per annum growth, then you're talking about real growth in that tax base of around 400 million per annum. Now, and this is important, if London grew faster than the national figure, national average, the Exchequer would also gain, because the Exchequer that is, would still control the 88% of the tax base, which still makes it a very, very centralised system of public finance. So that would grow too. So if London grows, the Exchequer's yield also grows. If London grows more slowly, the Exchequer would be protected. So there's no argument that London uniquely can gain from this. Quite the opposite. London can lose, but the rest of the country will gain if London gains. So 90 billion of the London tax yield, or more than that, would remain within the Exchequer's control. This is not Home Rule for London. This is a very, very modest proposal. But it would mean that London would be able to fund a larger amount of local investment. And this would grow in line with population growth, which is another thing at the moment. All the discussions, this came out in the Institute for Fiscal Studies work published yesterday, all the discussions about the impact of austerity, have to be seen against the backdrop in London of a population rising by 100,000 a year. So when you freeze spending on the NHS, it's in a city where the population's rising by 100,000 a year, which is really a cut per capita. So this would take account, at least in part, of that. I should add, Andrew is here. Andrew is chairing a group that's looking at the possibility of investing in Crossrail 2. And this kind of yield, that 400 million, could contribute, I'm sure Andrew will refer to this, could contribute to funding of a project like that. It wouldn't only fund that, it would actually be big enough to do more than that, but it would help. You can imagine borrowing against that yield every year would actually raise a substantial amount of money to help London pay for some of its own infrastructure. Now, just to conclude, something must be done, as the Prince of Wales very nearly said the other day, following another Prince of Wales before him. The UK is a remarkably centralised country. I hope I've made that clear. Scotland and Wales, in addition to their existing devolution, are to be given wide tax-raising powers. They'll have virtually all the taxes that we've suggested for the LFC, plus income tax. England gets no devolution at all. England will remain entirely as it is today. Centralised public finance of the kind we now have, and it is the most centralised system of all the big countries in the OECD, has not, repeat, not led to regional or territorial equality. You might have thought in a system this centralised we would not have the kind of disparities we have in terms of GDP per head between London, which is affluent, and many of the other cities which have GDPs per head below the national average. And yet this system has produced that level of inequality. So it's very difficult to argue that more centralisation would lead to more equality because you can't have any more centralisation. Interestingly, the core cities, and we're hugely in their debt for this, endorsed the LFC report. And in fact, London and the core cities are working together to help try to implement these policies on the grounds, and we made this explicit in the report. If this works for London, there's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't work for Greater Manchester, the Leeds City region, or any of the other city regions that have emerged latterly. Just to conclude, the current arrangements, the ones that are in place today, in our view, the LFC's view, undermine effective decision-making about local priorities and investment. They lead to overbidding, so cities, when they have a sort of system where you bid to the Treasury for everything, it's like trying to win the lottery. You bid for the biggest thing you can get, and most of the time you don't get it. In this system, to a limited degree, city regions would have to think, what do we really want? And then we will have to pay for it, and we will have to justify it locally. And our view was that that would lead to a more efficient use of public resources. So just to conclude, radical by British standards, very modest by international standards, and a strong belief that something must be done. Thank you very much.